Black Madonnas are medieval 12th, 15th century depictions of the Virgin Mary and the infant Jesus with dark skin, found mainly in Europe, with an estimated 400–500 examples preserved in Catholic and Orthodox shrines. At first glance, they raise a simple but unsettling question: why are they black? Yet the deeper you look, the more this question pulls you into a story that stretches across centuries, empires, faith, power, and memory, hidden in mountain monasteries, guarded in ancient cathedrals, and carried through wars and revolutions. These images were never marginal. They stood at the very heart of European spirituality. Pilgrims crossed continents to kneel before them. Kings crowned them queens. Nations prayed to them in moments of despair. And still, their true origins remain debated, misunderstood, or quietly ignored. For some, Black Madonnas are dismissed as accidents of time darkened by smoke, fire, or age. For others, they are intentional, symbolic, even radical representations that challenge later ideas about race, holiness, and sacred beauty. Why do so many of these figures appear in places tied to miracles, resistance, and national survival? Why did devotion to them grow strongest during periods of crisis, plague, invasion, occupation, and oppression? This is not just a story about religious art. It is a story about who gets to define the sacred, whose image is remembered, and whose is rewritten. It is about how belief travels, transforms, and survives, sometimes in forms that refuse to fit neatly into official explanations. In this video, we will uncover the untold history behind the Black Madonnas, their mysterious beginnings, their power over collective identity, and the meanings layered into their darkened faces. If you are interested in hidden history, forgotten symbolism, and stories that challenge what we think we know, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you do not miss what comes next. The story begins now. As we move deeper into this story, the question that quietly follows us from shrine to shrine becomes harder to ignore. If these figures were once meant to be pale, if their darkness were nothing more than the side effect of time, smoke, or candlelight, then history asks us to accept a remarkable coincidence. It would mean that across Europe, separated by mountains, borders, languages, and centuries, the same transformation happened again and again in precisely the same way. Faces darkened, hands darkened, yet garments, crowns, and surrounding details remained largely untouched. Wood, stone, and paint behaved as if guided by an invisible hand, altering only the flesh. This explanation, long repeated and rarely questioned, begins to feel fragile when placed beside the sheer number of Black Madonnas and the places they inhabit. These are not forgotten statues left in damp corners. They stand at the center of devotion, elevated on altars, guarded by tradition, and preserved with extraordinary care. Many were restored multiple times, repainted, cleaned, and examined by artists and clerics who clearly understood the difference between damage and design, and still, their dark skin endured. More striking is the timing. Black Madonnas appear across wide regions: France, Spain, Italy, Poland, Switzerland during a period when Christian imagery was still fluid, before later artistic standards fixed sacred figures into narrow visual norms. This was an era when symbols mattered deeply, when images taught theology to those who could not read, and when color carried meaning far beyond aesthetics. Darkness was not absence. It was mystery, depth, fertility, endurance. In sacred language, black soil was the source of life. Night was the threshold of revelation. The womb of creation was never imagined as white. When we connect this to what came later, the contrast becomes sharper. As European power expanded and Renaissance ideals reshaped religious art, the sacred gradually acquired the features of the ruling culture. Lighter skin, refined faces, idealized bodies became the standard, and earlier images that did not conform were reinterpreted rather than explained. It became easier to blame smoke than to confront the possibility that these figures were always meant to look this way. Yet the devotion surrounding Black Madonnas never faded. In moments of crisis, plague, invasion, political collapse, people did not turn away from these images. They turned toward them. They prayed before faces that mirrored suffering, endurance, and closeness to the earth. The darkness of these Madonnas did not distance the faithful. It drew them in. It made the divine feel present, grounded, and intimate rather than remote and idealized. Seen this way, the argument that their color is merely accidental no longer feels neutral. It becomes a convenient simplification, one that smooths over uncomfortable questions about memory, power, and cultural inheritance. If the darkness is accidental, it can be ignored. If it is intentional, it demands interpretation. It asks us to consider whose image was preserved, whose was replaced, and why certain forms of holiness were allowed to endure only under the label of anomaly. The story of the Black Madonnas is not about a single origin or a single meaning. It is about continuity across time, about symbols that survived shifts in doctrine and taste because they spoke to something older and deeper than official explanation. Their darkened faces remain not as errors to be corrected, but as witnesses silent, enduring, and unresolved, inviting us to look again at the past with more honest eyes. As the centuries moved forward, the visual language of Christianity began to change in ways that were subtle at first, then decisive. The Renaissance did not arrive with an announcement that sacred images would be redefined. Yet its influence quietly redrew the face of the divine. Artists turned their attention to anatomy, proportion, light, and idealized beauty, drawing inspiration from classical Greek and Roman forms. In doing so, they did more than refine technique. They reshaped how holiness itself was imagined. Before this shift, Christian imagery was diverse, shaped by the regions where belief took root. Icons carried echoes of the Eastern Mediterranean, North Africa, and the Levant, places where Christianity was born and first spread. Skin tones varied, facial structures differed, and symbolism mattered more than realism. The sacred was not meant to reflect an earthly ideal, but a spiritual truth. This was the world in which the Black Madonnas emerged, their presence accepted, venerated, and woven into the devotional life of entire communities. The Renaissance, however, introduced a new authority, the eye of the artist. Figures of Jesus and Mary were increasingly filtered through European standards of beauty and identity. Lighter skin, symmetrical features, and refined expressions became the visual shorthand for purity and perfection. These images traveled far beyond the churches that housed them. They were copied, studied, and repeated, gradually establishing themselves as the natural way the sacred should appear. Over time, repetition hardened into expectation. As these new depictions gained dominance, earlier forms were not always removed, but they were quietly reinterpreted. Images that did not align with Renaissance ideals were explained away rather than understood. Darkness became something to justify instead of something to contemplate. The question shifted from "what does this image mean?" to "why does it not look like the others?" In that shift, an entire layer of symbolic memory began to fade. This transformation did not happen in isolation. It unfolded alongside expanding European influence, new trade routes, and growing systems of power that linked culture, authority, and belief. Visual uniformity served clarity, but it also served control. When the sacred wears a single face, difference becomes deviation. Against this backdrop, the Black Madonnas stood as quiet contradictions, reminders of an earlier visual language that refused to disappear. What makes their survival remarkable is not just that they remained, but that they continued to command devotion. Pilgrims did not abandon them for newer, more fashionable images. They returned generation after generation, drawn to figures that felt older, heavier with meaning, and closer to lived experience. In their dark faces, many saw suffering that mirrored their own, endurance shaped by time, and a form of holiness that did not depend on idealized beauty. The Renaissance gave Christianity masterpieces, but it also narrowed the visual spectrum of the sacred. What was gained in artistic realism was often lost in symbolic depth. The Black Madonnas remind us that Christian imagery was never meant to be monolithic. It was born at crossroads of cultures, languages, and peoples, and its earliest visual expressions reflected that complexity. By placing these darker figures back into the historical flow, not as anomalies but as survivors, we begin to see the story more clearly. They are not interruptions in Christian art history. They are part of its foundation. Their continued presence challenges the idea that later images replaced earlier ones because they were truer. Instead, it suggests something more human and more revealing. That what we choose to elevate, repeat, and normalize often tells us as much about power and identity as it does about faith itself. As the visual language of Christianity narrowed and older symbols were gradually pushed to the margins, certain Black Madonnas moved in the opposite direction. Rather than fading into obscurity, they stepped into history as living witnesses, absorbing the hopes, fears, and struggles of entire nations. Nowhere is this more evident than in the stories of Our Lady of Częstochowa in Poland and Our Lady of Montserrat in Spain, two images that became far more than objects of devotion. They became mirrors in which a people recognized themselves. In Poland, the Black Madonna of Częstochowa emerged not as a distant heavenly figure, but as a presence that endured alongside the nation through centuries of upheaval. Her scarred face, marked by visible wounds, carried a meaning that no polished image ever could. Those marks told a story of violence survived rather than erased, of injury remembered rather than hidden. As Poland faced invasions, partitions, and occupations, so the image remained, fixed in place while borders dissolved and rulers changed. To pray before her was not only an act of faith, but an act of continuity, a way of asserting that the nation still existed even when political power was stripped away. Over time, the Madonna of Częstochowa came to embody collective suffering transformed into endurance. She was not celebrated because she was untouched by pain, but because she reflected it. Mothers saw their grief in her gaze, soldiers their fear, and ordinary people their daily struggle. In moments when survival itself felt uncertain, the image offered something stronger than reassurance. It offered recognition. The bond between the figure and the nation deepened with every crisis, until devotion to her became inseparable from Polish identity itself. A similar story unfolded on the rugged mountain of Montserrat in Spain, though shaped by a different landscape and history. High above the surrounding plains, the Black Madonna of Montserrat was encountered not in the center of power, but at a place that demanded effort to reach. Pilgrimage there was a physical act, a journey upward that mirrored an inner search for meaning, over centuries. So, the mountain's sanctuary became a gathering point for those seeking healing, protection, and a sense of belonging that transcended political change. For Catalonia, the Madonna of Montserrat came to represent continuity in a land marked by shifting authority and cultural tension. Her dark figure, seated calmly amid stone and silence, suggested stability rooted in the land itself. She was not imposed from above, but discovered, according to tradition, and allowed to remain where she was found. This detail mattered. It framed her not as a symbol carried in by power, but as one that emerged from the place and the people themselves. In both cases, these Black Madonnas became symbols of resistance without ever wielding force. They offered a different kind of strength, one grounded in memory, shared suffering, and spiritual persistence. When political structures failed or turned hostile, devotion did not disappear. It intensified. So, the images became gathering points where identity could be affirmed without words, where belief and belonging quietly reinforced one another. What unites these stories is not miracle alone, but meaning. These Madonnas endured because they carried more than doctrine. They carried history. Their dark faces absorbed generations of prayer, grief, and hope, becoming layered with significance that no later reinterpretation could fully erase. In a world that often tried to simplify or standardize the sacred, they remained complex, rooted, and unmistakably human. Through them, faith did not escape history. It entered it, stood within it, and refused to leave. As these images became woven into the identities of nations and communities, their influence did not remain symbolic alone. Around many Black Madonnas grew a living tradition of miracles, pilgrimages, and formal recognition that transformed quiet devotion into collective movement. Roads, rituals, and calendars began to bend around them, marking their presence not only in sacred spaces, but in the rhythms of everyday life. What mattered most was not a single extraordinary event, but the accumulation of countless stories carried from one generation to the next. Pilgrimage lies at the heart of this tradition. Long before modern transport, people walked for days or weeks to reach these shrines, driven by hope, gratitude, or desperation. The journey itself became part of the meaning. Each step affirmed belief, endurance, and trust in something larger than the individual. When pilgrims arrived before a Black Madonna, they were not meeting an unfamiliar image. They were confronting a presence already shaped by the prayers of those who came before them, a presence made powerful through repetition and shared experience. Miracle accounts. So, whether involving healing, protection, or unexpected deliverance, played a central role in sustaining this devotion. These stories followed familiar patterns across regions, yet each was deeply local, tied to specific moments of crisis or need. Communities remembered not only what was said to have happened, but when it happened and why it mattered. Over time, these narratives formed a collective memory that reinforced trust in the image's spiritual authority. Faith was no longer abstract. It was anchored to places where something meaningful was believed to have occurred. Official recognition by church authorities added another layer to this dynamic. Investigations, declarations, and feast days did not create devotion, but they acknowledged and stabilized it. When a shrine received formal approval, it validated what the faithful already practiced, bringing popular belief into dialogue with institutional structure. This relationship was often cautious and gradual, shaped by tradition rather than sudden decree. Yet once recognized, these sites gained a permanence that protected them from being dismissed as local curiosity or superstition. What is striking is that this recognition did not dilute the distinct character of Black Madonnas. Despite being fully integrated into church life, they retained their unique visual and symbolic identity. Their dark skin was not altered to match later artistic norms. Instead, it became part of their authority, inseparable from the history of devotion that surrounded them. In this way, belief preserved what aesthetics alone might have erased. The scale of pilgrimage also mattered. Annual gatherings drew tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands, creating moments when individual faith merged into collective expression. Songs, candles, and silent prayer filled spaces shaped as much by emotion as by stone. These gatherings reinforced belonging, reminding participants that they were part of something continuous and shared. In times of uncertainty, such moments offered stability and reassurance without the need for explanation. Through centuries of change, reform, and debate, the Black Madonnas remained remarkably resilient. Their authority did not rest on argument or doctrine alone, but on lived experience. People returned because they believed something meaningful happened there, whether seen or unseen. In that return, devotion renewed itself, not as blind repetition, but as a relationship sustained through time. Seen within the broader story, miracles, pilgrimages, and recognition were not separate elements, but interconnected threads. Together, they transformed these images from objects of art into centers of gravity within spiritual life. They explain why, despite shifting ideals and reinterpretations, the Black Madonnas never disappeared. They were not preserved because they were old, but because they continued to matter. As we reach the close of this journey, through the history of Black Madonnas, it becomes clear that their darkened faces carry layers of meaning that go far beyond the surface. Some scholars point to biblical symbolism, most notably the verse from the Song of Songs, "I am black, but beautiful," suggesting that the darkness of these images was never accidental, but a deliberate choice to convey beauty, resilience, and divine worthiness in a form that challenged later assumptions about holiness. Others see deliberate theological symbolism at play, where darkness itself becomes a marker of mystery, depth, and connection to the earth, reminding the faithful that the sacred is often rooted in the soil of life, suffering, and renewal. At the same time, the Black Madonnas reflect the power of inculturation, the way Christianity absorbed and transformed pre-Christian Earth Mother imagery. Statues and paintings of dark-skinned maternal figures existed long before the rise of the Church, and their symbolism of fertility, protection, and life cycles was reimagined through a Christian lens, linking the story of Mary and Jesus to the rhythms of the natural world and the lived experience of humanity. This blending of traditions enriched the spiritual landscape, allowing the Church to honor what came before while teaching new narratives, creating a continuity that spoke to believers across generations. Beyond theology and art, the Black Madonnas also point to a far deeper history, humanity's African origins. Their dark skin can be seen as a subtle reminder of the first peoples, the ancestral connection that predates borders, empires, and the visual conventions that later defined sacred art. In this sense, every Black Madonna becomes a bridge between past and present, between continents and cultures, and between the human and the divine. They remind us that spirituality is not only a matter of doctrine or aesthetics, but also of memory, identity, and the stories we pass from one generation to the next. The beauty of the Black Madonnas lies in their ability to resist a single explanation. They invite contemplation, study, and devotion precisely because they hold multiple truths at once. They are at once historical artifacts, theological statements, deconspectors, cultural bridges, semsimti, and living symbols of faith and resilience. They embody continuity in a world of change, permanence in the face of upheaval, and the enduring power of representation to shape belief, identity, and collective memory. Through them, we see how art, spirituality, and human experience are inseparably intertwined, and how devotion can survive even when understanding is partial or contested. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the hidden and fascinating history of the Black Madonnas. If you found this story as captivating as we did, do not forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you won't miss our future explorations into history, art, and the mysteries that have shaped human belief. Every view, every subscription, and every share helps us continue to uncover the stories that history left in shadows but are waiting to be seen in full light.